Yeah, so in 1965, Danny Lyon, who's an incredible guy, he was in his early 20s and he went to the University of Chicago and was looking for something to photograph, and he had built a motorcycle actually in his dorm room and found a club to ride with. That turned out to be the Chicago Outlaws, which then turned into one of the largest motorcycle gangs in the world, second only to the Hells Angels. And he rode with them for most of 1965, and in 1968, he first published this book. I should say though, when he was 19, Danny, the son of a dentist in New York, traveled down to Georgia to photograph the civil rights movement, and he became John Lewis's roommate. And he took some of the most iconic civil rights photographs that you've probably seen, and that's when he was 19. So that was before he did the BIKERIDERS. And when I went to go see him, he lives part of the year in New Mexico. He was very gracious to me, and I sat down and I started to explain, I want to make a film about subculture, and I think there's this cycle in society, and I kind of blathered for like 30 minutes. And he shook his head and he was like, "So, you don't want to make a movie about a photographer?" But to answer your question, yeah, the photographs alone, if you only take the photographs, they're inspirational. But when you combine them with these select interviews that he was really into new journalism. So he didn't want to just write, his thoughts. He really wanted to put it in the words of people that he interviewed. So they read like monologues. So a lot of the dialogue is there are pieces of it that are directly taken from that. And when you combine the photographs, which are romantic, even though they're certainly greasy and kind of rough, when you combine them though with the interviews, you get this really complete picture of a subculture and of human beings. And that's what most interested me.
Yeah, the film is incredibly immersive into this world, into their world. And starting with a photo book can get you to a certain level, but obviously there's an enormous amount of care and specificity that is from your brain, and I imagine further research. So how did you go about working the screenplay out exactly, and particularly settling on what's a pretty complex structure, I think?
Yeah, it took a while, because there was no narrative. And so the first thing that kind of popped up was the idea of this love triangle, which obviously wasn't represented anywhere in the interviews. There was a real Kathy, and she talked about a real Benny, and her opening, kind of story about walking into that bar and him sitting outside of her house all night. That was there, but this idea that there would be the leader of this club that would also be infatuated by this young writer, that's kind of where I started to come in. And that started to become, I guess to use a term, that started to become the plot. I knew that I wanted it to show the overarching, shape of the club from the late 50s to the early 70s, from a regional club to something that kind of metastasizes into something more violent by the early 70s. I knew that shape would be there, but it was really that plot and those character dynamics that I had to come up with.
We have costume and sound represented here, so we'll focus for a moment on that. Jeff, what were your initial conversations with these folks about how you wanted the film to sound and look in those departments, and what were the real points of focus in that department?
Well, we'll start. I've worked with Erin since Midnight Special, so we did Midnight Special, Loving, and now the BIKERIDERS together. And she's the greatest costume designer in the business. No offense to any other costume designer. Sorry. She's really good.
She's got a really good one, though.
Okay, sorry. But when I talk about subculture, like a big part of that is the way people look, the way they dress, and their style. I was really inspired by the punk rock scene in the mid-90s in Little Rock, Arkansas, of all places. And you would see these kids, and they look like they stumbled out of the gutter, but then you're like, oh, no, no, no. Like, the way they wear their jeans, the way they wear their hair, everything is so specific. It's really a defining element of a subculture. And I knew from looking at these photographs that we had to get that right. And that's where Aaron comes in.
Yeah, I think that the greatest thing that Jeff has always done is been able to communicate character to me. So, we didn't even need to talk about, denim and leather and all the things like that, or, all the details that did eventually go into it, but it was more just about Jeff being able to communicate the, who is Cal and who is Zipco, and, all those pictures at the end are actually, they are the characters. So we kind of we actually really modeled each character after a real one. So it was, in a way, it was very easy.
Sure it was. For you about 1,000 patches that you sewed on, hundreds of jeans you had to age and dye. Yeah. And they had this person walking around with this sack of dirt, and they would just throw dirt on people.
It still didn't look that dirty. It was so much dirtier.
There was one photograph in particular, and the book that I was drawn to actually was a 2003 reissue, which was really important because the original book didn't have color photographs. But the first book that I encountered did. And there's this one, and it's the character Cal, and he's sitting on his bike at a gas station. And the density of color, I shared it with each department and was like, if we can have a frame in our film that looks this dense, then we've succeeded. And you have to look at the grease in their fingernails and the way they've sewn these patches on and all of the details. And Aaron, which is amazing, I think today we see this and we think, well, they look like bikers. But you really have to look at all the detail that they've put in, because the characters are different and they have their own personalities and they are kind of expressing their own characters through the way they dress and the way they have their hair and how that shifts throughout the course of a decade. So it's an immense amount of work. I just want to make sure everybody hears that.
I will just talk about the patches for a second because I think it is unique. We couldn't just buy patches. We had to make everything so that it wasn't, copyrightable. So every single patch we signed and made and then aged and then sewed on and then aged again and then and we had multiples for all of our riders. So all of our main characters had at least 8 versions of exactly the same aged thing, which was my biggest challenge, I would say.
Well, and if you notice in the films, the club grows. It begins and our bottom rockers are all Chicago, but it starts to grow through the Midwest. So we start adding Milwaukee and Cincinnati and Columbus and all these other things. So everything, it wasn't stationary. It all had to evolve through the course of the decade too. So, and then for the sound, this was the first time Amanda and I worked together. She was on set with us, and I thought did a beautiful job because we didn't make her life easy.
There were a few trains, a few fights.
Motorcycles are not quiet, but you did an incredible job capturing those sounds, and she had microphones everywhere. Trying to get the unique quality of these bikes because they're like characters. And there was this beautiful handoff then from Amanda to Will, and Will and I went to college together, so we've known each other for a very long time. He's worked on really all my films. I think I can say that because you even took past the Shock Stories at some point. Technically. Yeah, technically. And it just so happens that a friend of mine from college turned out to be one of the greatest sound designers in town. But yeah, I mean, we knew when we were on set, and Amanda can attest to this, when you stand in the middle of 40 motorcycles, 40 1960s Harley Davidson motorcycles, you feel something. You literally feel something. And we needed that represented in the film, and that's where Will came.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Jeff's movies always have a lived-in quality, and we always try to embody that with the way we approach the sound. And one of the main things, of course, is we try to be as authentic as possible, and that means not using ADR whenever we possibly can. Although we did do a fun thing on this one, where we got a couple of the actors together just to riff and like just have background chatter.
Right.
That like literally Jeff directed them, and like we had like little scenes, little vignettes happening in the back of some of these scenes that you might not have even really clocked, but it gives an energy to the scene that's sort of like an adjunct to what's happening on screen.
It's insane when your background actors are Michael Shannon and Boyd Holbrook.
Right.
It's like, you guys, we just do some balls, talk it up.
But you know, that was the real challenge on this film in particular, is how do you make it feel authentic? You know, how do you really? I think the key, usually there's always one scene, and that's the scene that we use to figure out how the movie's going to sound. For this one, it was absolutely when she's on the back of Benny's bike, and she first feels what it feels like to be surrounded by those motorcycles, just like we were just saying. And that was, once we figured out how to make it feel like that to her, because that was really the moment of the film that she has to fall in love with not only Benny, but also with motorcycle culture, and accept that she's basically going to have to share her life with these machines and him. And so it was really important. We had to really approach that as a kind of a tender scene in a funny way, even though it's about these 20 machines roaring around her. But the approach to it was very romantic, I think. And part of that too was we had a chance to have so much fun with all this great needle drop music in the film. And we did a thing that I've never really seen done to the degree that we did. We took all these 60-year-old songs, and we used the latest technology, which lets us basically split the songs apart into drums and bass and guitar and background vocals. And we were able to actually take these songs and kind of reassemble them in ways that let us use them as score more than they could if we just hit play. And it also you probably heard, I mean, we really went deep with, surrounding the audience with the music as much as possible. Some of these songs were recorded in mono. So, it was like kind of a difficult thing, and it was quite a challenge to, when Jeff said, I don't really want to use score, I really want to try to make these songs work. And then there was an exploration of, well, how do we then take what these songs are at their core and then expand on it so that they can really function the way that we needed them to function emotionally in the film.
I'm always shocked, Will, whenever we work together, just how you find room for everything. Like, because it feels like it should all just be, a jumble of motorcycles. And then you add in this very high-pitched Shangri-La song on the top, and I don't know. I'm always impressed you find room for all of it somehow.
Yeah, sound design and mixing it's like a magic trick where it's like sleight of hand, I guess. You're trying to kind of pass the baton from one sound to the next without the audience understanding that you're taking things away constantly. Because otherwise, if you saw what we were doing, if you saw the Faders movie, you'd be like, that's ridiculous. Like, why can't I hear that thing anymore? That's happening right there. But the reality is, we don't want you to think about that thing that's right there. We want you to be with the character, whatever moment they're having, and we want to try to help you understand how they're feeling about what's happening. And that's the coolest thing about sound, at least in post-production. What Amanda does is a lot grittier, unfortunately. But we can sit in a nice room like this and sort of say, how do we make this?
What was the coldest it got for you?
Oh yeah, it was only 68 on stage.
Because the night that we killed Johnny was miserable.
It got down to 22 that night.
Yeah, I was getting text messages from Amanda the whole time about how miserable it was.
Cincinnati is lovely.
You're welcome.
But it's
Do you
not
remember when they were almost the Chicago from Ohio? I mean, when we almost made our gang from
Ohio.
Yeah, do you remember that moment?
I do remember that.
I think I convinced you to do it because the Illinois patches said ILL and ill was cooler.
I'm sure that was as much thought as I put into it.